Hello and welcome back to the World Leader Leaderboard, the podcast where we rank every world leader and tell you who's winning and losing each week. This week I'm joined by Rory.
Hello.
Zach.
Hello.
And Georgina.
Hello.
How are you all doing?
Very well.
Good, yeah.
Very
good.
Nice sunny day today.
It's a lovely day to be in a room with no windows.
Yeah.
We've got a big episode coming up too. We've got some movement, we've got some announcements, and we have a new addition to the board. But who will it be and will they be going up or down? We'll find out later in the episode. One thing to note before we get too deep into the episode, this was recorded on Monday, the 28th of April. And as such, the Canadian election results haven't been released yet. So no one will be moving anyone Canadian, but we likely will next week to make up for it. But just because this is being released afterwards, we want to make that clear. Okay, with that noted, let's dive in and let's start with our winners of the week. Rory, let's start down your end. Who is your winner of the week this week?
So my winner of the week is Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. He's not been too involved in what I'm going to talk about, but his people have, obviously. And this is the Iran nuclear talks between Iran and the US. Just last week, the end of last week saw, I think, the third round of talks between the two countries, and then they're moving on to a fourth round at some point. There have been some generally positive sounds coming out of these talks. I think the Iranian team said they're cautiously optimistic that a deal can be reached, while Trump, in a sort of very long and quite wide-ranging time interview, said he was pretty sure a deal will happen. So he was a bit more optimistic. This is good news for Iran because we've talked about this in many podcasts and videos before. The last few years have been pretty brutal for Iran, both economically, well, mainly economically, and sort of reaching a deal that on its nuclear program with the US could open it up to foreign investment, could help it sort of be relieved from sanctions that have been hitting the country for years. There's still a long way to go, but I think the fact that Trump does seem really keen on pursuing a deal with Iran is the biggest sort of green flag for them. Mm-hmm. And he seems to have reined in Israel from attacking Iran at the moment. You know, we'll see if that changes, but so far so good on that front. When you compare this to Trump's first term, where I think his position, he called it maximum pressure on Iran, sort of maximum economic pressure. He and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, those two were pretty tough on Iran, both rhetorically and policy-wise. But this time round, we've seen both Trump and Mohammed bin Salman pursue a much more friendly relations with Iran. We had the Saudi, I think, defense minister was in Iran just last week or just a few weeks ago for what was a really high-level visit. I think he met with the Supreme Leader Khamenei and the president. So you see Saudi Arabia taking this much more friendly position towards Iran. And this is something we actually covered in a recent video, which I'll shout out, this sort of new anti-Israel axis, Saudi Arabia, Iran and Turkey, I think. So yeah, this is all good news for Khamenei. I think Trump's return could have signaled that return to that maximum pressure campaign, but so far we haven't seen that. Interesting.
I'm not sure which one of you wants to dive into this deeper, because obviously you brought it up, Rory, but Zach wrote the video. But on the nuclear deal specifically, which, as you say, is one of the potential kind of bright spots for Khamenei and one of the reasons for him moving here, what's the current status of that? Obviously, this was something that was introduced under Obama. As you said, it was then rolled back under Trump's first term. What's the current status of that? What would that look like were it to be re-implemented? And who's on either side of this debate? Who wants it? Who doesn't want it at this stage?
what I think is interesting about it is that it's so far from the sort of reading between the lines from public comments by Marco Rubio and others, it basically looks like Trump is literally speed running the negotiations that happened in the lead up to the 2015 JCPOA. So like there was this whole furore at the start of the negotiations because the Americans said you can't have any domestic enrichment capacity. This is exactly the line that the Europeans and the US, or under Obama, took way back in like the early 2010s. And then following literally the exact same path of argument, the Iranians said, no, we can't be dependent on foreign imports. And the Americans said, that's fair enough. But you can only not enrich past a certain percentage. And the Iranians said, fair enough. And then that's a question of like, how do we supervise that? How do you make sure you don't enrich past a certain percentage? This is exactly the same argument that we had like literally a decade ago. It's sort of crazy that we're getting there. And you know, assuming current trends continue, that means we'll probably just end up with basically a version of the 2015 deal. It's going to look very, very similar to Obama's deal.
And what are the key points of that deal?
The key points of that deal was it was limited how much enrichment capacity Iran had by, I think they're not called reactors. I can't remember what they're called, the processing units. And it basically said that Iran couldn't have enriched uranium past a certain percentage, and all that was subject to supervision by the UN's nuclear watchdog. The thing that Republicans, or more hawkish Republicans, never liked about that deal is that by still allowing Iran, there was a time limit, so the deal was going to lapse at some point anyway, but by still allowing Iran to have some enrichment capacity, it meant that Iran was always sort of hypothetically able to build a bomb quite quickly, right? And more hawkish Republicans, in that sense, basically the idea behind Obama's nuclear deal, it was more about managing Iran's nuclear program and sort of hoping that by slowing things down, you'd basically provide the political space for Iran to like normalize relations with the rest of the world and then hopefully become a normal country that didn't need a nuclear bomb. And more hawkish Republicans were like, "This is never going to happen. Iran's never going to normalize relations with the world. We need to just bomb Iran's nuclear facilities and just get it done with." And it looks like Trump is moving towards quite a similar position. And for the exact same reasons, some of the more hawkish Republicans, especially in his administration, are getting a little bit upset about that. But I think,
do you think he knows that he's basically doing that? Or does he think he is coming to a massively better deal than Obama? Because in that Time interview, he said something like, no one else could make a deal with Iran, which just obviously isn't true. And he looks like he's going to make a very similar deal to Obama. But
I mean, I agree with you. I think we are just getting to that exact same point. I mean, maybe there will be some more concessions. I think the Iranians are in a weaker position than they were in 2015. And I think that's one of the reasons this negotiations are happening faster, right? Is that the Iranians are willing to make more concessions and sort of like fudge their positions a bit more. But it doesn't sound like he knows it. I mean, sometimes you hear Marco Rubio say stuff like, well, you hear him make comments which literally sound like they're copy and pasted from 2012 or whatever it was, and you're like, how does he not realize? Like, you could just Google this and be like, oh, someone else said these exact same words a decade ago, but whatever. I think it's a pretty good outcome, by the way, because I think one of the important differences here, right, is that this time the Saudis are enthusiastic, as Roy mentioned, about an Iran nuclear deal, and I think basically the only people now who don't want an Iran nuclear deal are the Israelis. And I think that's probably good for regional stability if it's something that everyone apart from the Israelis want. I mean, that's just one unhappy party as opposed to, well, last time around, quite a lot of the Arab states were more anxious about Iran and so really didn't want a nuclear deal.
Okay. It's interesting how this is playing out. It'll be interesting to see if a deal is reached, how similar the deal is. I'm sure we'll come back to this in a future episode. And good video on it.
Oh, thank you.
Last
Very
week.
kind.
I mean, it was a good one. I animated it, so I'm half praising myself. But it was a cracker. You should check it out. Zach, who is your winner of the week?
My winner of the week is going to be Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And this is pretty simple. It's just because, as everyone will probably already know, for the past couple of weeks, Trump has basically been presenting his negotiations as if Zelensky is the obstacle to peace. But in the past couple of days, after a sort of impromptu meeting at the Pope's funeral, it looks like Trump is sort of coming round to Zelensky's position, and he released a pretty furious Truth Social post, which is apparently how we do geopolitics these days, where he had a go at Putin and said, stop bombing people. I think there was Vladimir Stop, which was a great line. I mean, who knows if this will last, but I think in a way, if you don't think that Putin is serious about peace, and I think I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that he isn't serious about peace, it was always sort of inevitable that that Trump was eventually going to turn on him. You can only sort of come up with so many excuses before eventually Trump's going to go, well, look, you're saying no to every peace deal I present. Something has to change. So I think that's the main reason. The one other thing I'll say is that, there's always been this open question about what leverage does Trump have over Putin. And I would very tentatively suggest that the Russian economy is looking a little bit weak. So we don't really have very reliable data on this, but there are some sort of proxy indicators you can use to measure, like, basically economic activity, GDP in a country. Like, you can do stuff like measuring how often the lights are on by using satellite imagery. And I think Goldman Sachs has a sort of activity ticker that uses basically sort of retail data. Anyway, the point here is that has really dropped off in the past couple of months. And this is a trend that you see in lots of sort of inflation-ridden economies, is that inflation kicks up, people realize that their rubles aren't worth as much as they used to be, and they start spending them, but you run out of savings eventually. And then activity really, really declines. And that is fundamentally bad news for the Kremlin, especially when combined with the recent drop in oil prices.
Interesting, though, a real change in fortunes, as you say, because it wasn't long ago that we were pushing Zelensky down the board. I mean, he was at the bottom, now moved up one from the bottom, following the kind of disastrous Oval Office spat. I mean, not necessarily disaster. Well, it was disastrous for Zelensky, but like, you could argue it wasn't entirely his fault what happened. But yeah, you can see him moving kind of up is a real change in fortune. And as you say, at least partly because of Putin's actions there, of like the situation in Russia and the changing tides there. Do we expect Trump to continue on this path? As you say, you can never predict fully with Trump what's going to happen, and he could flip straight back. But I'm interested from Zach and more broadly, like, do we think this is a real turning point? Do we think this will force hands in negotiations? Or is this a momentary swing because Zelensky and Trump hung out at the Pope's funeral and then like he fired off some Truth Socials?
Yeah, and there's always a risk that he goes to hang out with Putin and then changes his mind.
Exactly.
I would say, I mean, I think that there's a risk, and that is what happened a couple of months ago. So there was a moment when, again, Trump was blaming Putin, and then I think his ire turned back to Zelensky in the past couple of weeks, because I think fundamentally because Zelensky has been resisting certain parts of Trump's more sort of like substantial peace plan that he's come out with. Originally, Zelensky was resisting the ceasefire, and then he said, okay, fine. Well, basically after the suspension of US military aid and intelligence sharing, Zelensky said, fine, I'll commit to a ceasefire. What I think Zelensky is making a bit of a strategic mistake here. Sometimes I understand why he can't agree to, stuff like the formal annexation of Crimea, right? But I think it's in his strategic interests to just sort of say, yeah, fine, as long as Russia agrees to a ceasefire. I think that haggling preemptively over the sort of details of a peace plan that's never going to happen, right, is just not in his interest. And he would be better off just basically putting all the responsibility on Putin every single time and saying, look, I'm down for whatever, but maybe not that particular term phrase, but then it's up to Putin to agree to some sort of provisional ceasefire in the first place, right? And I think that that's the fundamental issue at the heart of these negotiations, is that there are loads of ways that America can leverage Ukraine into agreeing to some sort of stoppage. But it's just, Putin clearly doesn't want peace. How do you force him to the table? And I think as long as Zelensky can basically deflect all of the sort of like niggles over the current peace deal and just say, look, just get Putin to agree to a ceasefire first, then we can talk. I think Trump will hopefully realize that that is the fundamental obstacle to peace here.
But do you think Ukraine's closeness with the EU could be an issue here in terms of Zelensky trying to appease Trump when Europe is seeing the US increasingly as an adversary? Because I think I heard over the weekend that the German defense minister, Boris Pistorius, is encouraging Ukraine not to accept to concede territory in Crimea.
I think maybe, but I think in the aggregate, it's a good thing. I think the main thing really here is it just all depends on how Europe responds, right, to Trump's various attempts at a peace plan. At the moment, I think it actually probably helps in lots of ways, because I think that if you didn't have at least the possibility that Europe will step up support to Ukraine in the event of Trump pushing some sort of very unfavorable peace deal on them, Ukraine would really have like zero leverage at all, right? And I think that the fact that Ukraine does still, at least rhetorically, have real support from Europe means that there's always this sort of like, Zelensky can always sort of, in the last instance, rely on the fact that Europe will support him if Trump pushes something that's completely and utterly unacceptable on him, right? That does give him not like necessarily leverage, but it just gives him like a degree of independence in these negotiations. And it means that Trump can't, basically force, in the worst case scenario, right? We were talking before. I mean, Putin has now said except freeze along the current front lines, but there was some chatter that Witkoff and Trump would basically cede all 4 oblasts, right? And that would in a sense essentially means ceding territory that Ukraine currently controls. And I think, without basically Europe saying, oh, that's unacceptable, Ukraine would have very little way of resisting those sort of very maximalist demands. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I think it just gives them a little bit of independence.
Interesting. We will obviously have to wait and see, as is the case with basically all of these. But we have to wait and see, because with something as unstable as Trump and a negotiation like this, I mean, all 3 pretty unstable characters of, Putin and Trump especially, but Zelensky too, obviously has very contrasting aims from Putin, naturally. So how this plays out, how these different characters shake out, Will be interesting to see as we get closer. Georgina, our final winner of the week. Who is it from you?
My winner of the week this week, and a new addition to the board, is the leader of the National Rally in France, Jordan Bardella. And this is because he gave an interview to the French newspaper Le Parisien at the weekend, confirming that if Marine Le Pen is barred from running, which she has been for 5 years because of her conviction for embezzlement of EU funds, Bardella will step forward and take the party into the next presidential election in 2027. And he's polling the strongest out of any candidate at the moment. In a Harris Interactive poll from the 8th to the 10th of April, Bardella was polling first with 37% support, followed by Le Pen on 36%. But of course, if she can't run, that's kind of redundant. And then interestingly quite close behind is Edouard Philippe on 35%, who we haven't spoken much about and isn't a name that we hear a lot in the news. But it's interesting that there's a 2-point difference according to this poll, which of course was 1,000 people, and we're still about a year and a half away from that election, or more than a year and a half, actually, nearly 2 years. So it's still very early days, but I think there's a logic to adding Bardella to the board, considering he is the front runner, and assuming Le Pen's conviction isn't overturned and the appeal doesn't come to anything, he'll be definitely one to watch, especially seeing his movement kind of contrasted with Macron's over the next couple of years. So that's why I'm adding him to the board.
Could you tell us a bit more about what you know about him as a politician and like his kind of place within the party? Because I think it's interesting, other similar movements to the National Rally in other countries. I mean, the obvious comparison maybe in the UK, like as soon as they lose their figurehead, as soon as they lose kind of a key person in the party itself begins to slip. And like UKIP being an obvious comparison when it lost Farage, and then the Brexit party come Reform Party, it kind of follows the fate of the leader to some extent. But clearly here, he is outperforming Le Pen at this stage in polling. Clearly there is a real chance of him succeeding and kind of carrying the party forward. So how is he viewed, do you think, within the French electorate? And what do you think is the future for him at the helm of the party?
Yeah, that is a really good point, because when we think of populist parties, they're often populist because of one sole figure. But I think from the start, for the past few years, Le Pen and Bardella have been acting as almost like a presidential ticket, like a kind of president and a
Vice president?
running mate, vice president running mate kind of situation, which is rare in European politics. I can't actually think of another example at that high level where we've seen that. And I think, fundamentally that was because Le Pen saw herself as becoming France's next president and wanted to have a prime minister that she'd prepped and primed and was ready to kind of come in straight away and just be her second in command. And Bardella was happy in that role. He's always been very careful in media interviews and even on stage in public to not upstage Le Pen. And that's also quite rare, I think, because when you get, again, politicians at that very high level, there's often a bit of discussion about, whether they could upstage or are trying to upstage their superior in a way. And it's, I wonder, I'm going off on a tangent now, but I wonder how Le Pen feels about this, because she clearly wanted to be France's next president. And until this ruling, it looked like that was going to happen. And now it looks like France might end up with this young, I think he's 29 at the moment, or 30.
Very young.
But by the time the presidential election comes around, he'll be early 30s. A relative political newcomer as well. And that would be a very striking reversal of things for the RN and for Le Pen herself. But I think
even when she's back in 5 years' time as well, the election will have happened. He could have potentially established himself as the new leader, the new figurehead.
She's missed a chance by that point.
Well, and then also, even if there's a chance that the party, were they elected, then suddenly become less popular, as often happens, and therefore she doesn't get the opportunity to replace him. And even if she could theoretically replace him in a future election, like obviously she's popular at this stage. So she might have totally missed the opportunity. In fact, looks fairly likely. Yeah,
it's also interesting to think though how Bardella will get on without Le Pen, because although she's been sentenced and given a 2-year prison sentence, which is suspended. So she'll probably spend it at home with an ankle bracelet.
Yeah.
She's not going to be, they're not going to be taking her out on tour with Bardella. And this is, I guess, like, the cub is coming out into the world on his own. And how will he fare?
True.
Because for so long they have been running as a duo, and now we've got solo Bardella.
Solo
Yeah.
Yeah.
Rory, did you
Well, I
have
was
something?
just going to add on to that. I mean, the temptation for Marine Le Pen, if she is sort of sidelined and he takes the lead, for her to sort of weigh in on what he's doing, and there's the potential for that, for clashes to emerge there. But yeah, I think it's a good addition.
Nice. Okay, great. A new addition. Haven't had one of those in a while. So thank you for bringing us a new person to the board, Georgina. Before we move to the audience suggestions, a quick too long update, which we always do here. But I'm going to say this isn't necessarily just a straight up promotion like it normally is. These are like 3 updates. So don't you skip through this. Update number 1, the next issue of Too Long 5, which comes out this summer, we have released a preview of the front cover. So if you're interested, if you're a Too Long fan, head to the website, toolong.news, and you can take a look at a preview of the next issue's front cover and what the theme of the next issue is. We will not be putting it on screen. You do have to go to the website, do some work. Second thing, the digital
Definitely not a
edition.
bog standard promo.
I said it wasn't a promo. Second thing, the digital edition of Too Long 4, that's the most influential person edition. This one here, the one that is just being published. The digital editions are now shipping immediately. So if you place an order, you will immediately be emailed a PDF issue of this. So if you want a copy, if you're sick of us talking about it, you just want to find out who's the top 25, you want to read our pieces, and you're not bothered about having a physical copy, if you buy the digital edition, it will be sent straight to you as of yesterday, I believe, or yesterday as of when we're recording. So just letting you know, if you want a digital edition, you don't have to wait. You can get them right now. They'll be sent straight to you. Also, if you've pre-ordered the digital edition and it didn't arrive yet, make sure to reach out to customer service and we can help with that. Finally, behind us over here, we have a little section. Oh, Georgina, looking at it, it's covered up. Sorry. It's kind of covered up anyway. We have all of the previous issues of the magazine, and why I'm shouting that out is because for the first time ever, every edition of the magazine is now in stock. Too Long's 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all in stock and will be sent to you right away if you order them, and Too Long 5 is now available to pre-order. So that's never happened. There's always been at least one copy that's out of stock. So if you're a bit of a collector, if you want to get your hands on some old editions so you can fill out your Too Long collection, or if you've been holding off buying because you're like, well, if I want them, I want all of them, they are all for sale and they're all on the store right now. Those are my 3 updates. Let's continue with the show. Okay, so next up, we're going to go into the audience suggestion. And obviously, this is the top comment from the previous episode. The person you've suggested is the person we either add or move on the board. Now, the top suggestion last week was our very own Zach Michaelis with a huge majority.
Oh my God.
In many ways, I am a world leader.
I'm afraid the caveat always applies. We will add the person at the top within reason.
That's
and
so
I think
sad.
Zach is not within reason.
I think we should
Very
debate the merits
grateful.
of adding Zach
I
to the
don't want
board.
to be on the board. I desperately don't want to be on the board. Be ruthless having writers move me up and down.
The editorial last week was quite rough, so Zach's moving down, I'm afraid. So Zach won't be added to the board. At some point, we could do a board with us on, but that's a separate board, and it will be a horrible episode.
Yeah,
but if we're
absolutely.
desperate for views, it could happen.
I don't think that's a very successful strategy on that front either.
Agreed. The
Okay,
person
fine.
we will be moving on the board, though, is Germany's Friedrich Merz. He was the highest reasonable suggestion.
Good suggestion.
I'm going to run down the panel. Rory, take it away. Is he a winner or a loser for you, and why?
Mertz, for me, is a loser of the week. And this is because his honeymoon period, if we can call it that, has effectively ended before. He's not even Chancellor yet. He's still incoming Chancellor. But if you look at the polls in Germany, they're quite remarkable now. And the AfD are in first place in a number of polls. They've overtaken his CDU, CSU. And that's, pretty bad. All the other parties have maintained their polling level over the last few weeks since the election, but it's basically just CDU decline, AfD rise. So that's pretty bad for him. He's coming into office really quite unpopular. And I saw there's one poll, I think it said something like 73% of people think he deceived the country at the election or
Wow.
around the election.
Deceived.
Yeah, which is quite strong.
What's the allegation
strong.
of deception?
So I think there were two main things. One is when he became leader of the party, I think he promised he wouldn't pass legislation with the support of the AfD, and he did that before
Yeah.
the election. And then the other one is that within a few weeks of the election, he, along with the SPD and the Greens, as we know, reformed Germany's debt brake, which I think he pledged not to do.
Okay.
I think that's right.
He did. He initially pledged not to,
Yeah.
and then he went back and opened it up.
Cheeky.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so those are the reasons why people, I think,
Okay.
don't really trust him. But yeah, it's not a great position to go into
Yeah.
government with.
Considering that he's not even
Yeah.
become chancellor yet, that doesn't sound great. Zach, do you agree? Is he a loser for you?
Yeah, I think Rory's articulated well. I think that's exactly why. Well, I think that's the main reason the polling has declined, right? Is that he does seem to have U-turned a couple of things. I mean, the main thing is that debt thing, right? It's about the debt brake. He didn't actually explicitly rule out any reforms to the debt brake, but he very strongly implied in a series of interviews that like it would not be a priority, and even if he did reform it, it would be tweaks to sort of. I mean, there was an interview he gave actually a couple of months ago where he basically said it'd be for investment, not for spending.
Okay.
And there were basically lots of signals that like he's going to be quite fiscally conservative.
Yeah.
He was also, so very quickly on that issue, he then rushed through those reforms to the debt brake that allowed hundreds of billions of euros in new spending. I mean, hypothetically, actually trillions of euros in new spending, about 500 billion for public investment, which is, to be fair, sort of sorely needed in Germany, but then a sort of unlimited amount of borrowing for further defense spending. But it's not just that, where I think that essentially more conservative Christian Democrat voters would be disappointed.
Yeah.
It's also that during the campaign, he sort of tacked towards the right, towards the AfD on a whole load of policy areas. I mean, immigration, for instance, climate policies as well. And I think in large part, this is just a consequence of coalition negotiations. It's just how they work. But he has been forced to moderate those positions. I think immigration is probably the most obvious one, where during the campaign, he was talking about basically imposing permanent border controls around Germany and turning back asylum seekers to sort of neighboring EU states. This was a violation of European law, or at least sort of superficially in tension with EU law, and definitely undermined Schengen.
Yeah.
And now that he's basically in the new coalition agreement, which was published last month or a couple of weeks ago, he's softened on both of those policies, and he's now saying we'll only turn back asylum seekers in cooperation with neighbouring member states, which just isn't going to happen because no member states want to cooperate on that front. And to sort of respect Schengen, he said that border controls will be temporary. So yeah, you can imagine if you're sort of somewhere on the border between the Christian Democrats and the AfD, and you lent your vote to Merz, you will be feeling a little bit disappointed, and you might be moving back to the AfD, or you will be, because that's what the polls say.
Georgina?
Yeah, not too much to add to either of those points. I agree with both. But I think from an electorate point of view, I reckon immigration is the bigger thing, because I think the debt brake was a big deal. And that was viewed as Merz giving concessions to the SPD, because it was something that Scholz had been pushing for as chancellor for a long time, held back by his own coalition partners. But I think that probably doesn't cut through to the public in the same way that immigration does.
Yeah.
And I agree with Zach. And I think for even just the optics, I suppose, of choosing to go into coalition with the SPD, who finished not second, the AfD did, but third, and, were viewed as a bit of a failure in government for 4 years.
Yeah.
Even that itself makes Merz look a bit weak, perhaps, in the eyes of, as Zach said, more socially conservative CDU voters. So I think that probably explains the shift in itself.
Interesting.
Can I say one more thing?
Sure.
Tiny thing. I think one of the things that's interesting is that he obviously rushed that debt brake reform through the Bundestag, because he had to do it before the newly elected MPs took their seats, because otherwise he wouldn't get the 2/3 majority, because there'd be too many AfD and left party voters who were going to basically resist those reforms. But one of the consequences of that I don't think anyone recognized at the time is that he essentially gave away all his leverage in coalition negotiations, right? Because the SPD, that was their main thing, as Georgia just said. They wanted a reform of the debt brake to fund public investment. And he had to do that very, very quickly, straight out the gates. But once he'd done that, it meant that he had no leverage over the SPD in the coalition negotiations. And they knew that he had no viable alternative coalition partner, because he had ruled out a coalition with the AfD. which meant this is one of the big reasons why they've been able to push him to the left on so many of these issues, which is, why he's in such trouble at the moment. And the last thing is that I think, obviously, there's a short-term cost to all this, and the polling doesn't look very, very good. But I do think in a way, I think we might look back on this in a couple of years' time and think that he made the right call, because I think that doing your U-turns nice and early is the politically savvy thing to do, right? Especially on debt. It looks a bit sort of cynical and a bit cheeky, but I think my intuition here, right, is that funding massive public investment splurges with debt as opposed to new tax rises in a couple of years' time is going to be more popular than it would have been if they'd done it with tax rises.
Interesting. Okay, well, looks like a consensus for him being a big old loser before he's even entered government, but we'll have to see once he enters government. I suppose if the coalition proves more successful than the SPD were on their own and more popular, maybe that will help. But yeah, it seems the AfD surge is continuing, and the slump of the major parties is also continuing even after they win an election. So Merz is moving down on our board from the very top to still pretty positive. Let us know in the comments who you want to see us move next time. You can also suggest people to be added to the board if you want, and whoever is the top comment is the person who'll be moved or added next week. So make sure you cast your votes. Also, let us know in the comments if you want us to make merch with Zach's favorite sayings, including "Can I say one more thing?" and last thing. If you want those on a hat, let us know. We could do that. Let's move to our losers of the week. Okay, Rory, let's start with you again. Who is your loser of the week?
My loser of the week is Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister of India. So the big news in India was that last week in Indian-administered Kashmir, there was a pretty significant terror attack that I think was the most deadly in the region in this century, basically. This has presented Modi with two quite significant challenges. The first is that his government for the last few years has been pushing this idea that they've stabilized the region of Kashmir. There's an ongoing insurgency for decades. They've stabilized it. They've boosted tourism. They've brought money to it, and that they've secured it. And that's been their big goal. And it's why they revoked the region's sort of semi-autonomy in 2019. But this terror attack has sort of shattered that, and it's really put them on the back foot, because obviously it shows that they haven't brought safety and security to the region. The attack is also probably going to really damage tourism. I think there were reports of tourists sort of leaving en masse in the immediate aftermath of the attack, and it's hard to imagine people are going to go back there soon, given the sort of tensions around it. So that's the sort of challenge one that it presents him. The second thing is that his government has pointed the finger at Pakistan, accused it of backing the insurgency that sort of carried out this attack. So Modi has responded by taking economic and diplomatic action against Pakistan, quite significant actions, but so far hasn't done anything militarily. And there's quite a significant feeling in India, quite a lot of sort of domestic fury against Pakistan, sort of going back before this, but really quite sort of fueled by this attack, that is demanding something more, some kind of military response. So he's going to have to balance these demands for military action with some kind of strategic restraint that he might consider to be a more sensible option. And that could lead him into a tricky situation. If he does sort of follow people's demands and attack Pakistan, that could, it probably will spark at least a sort of border skirmish or wider conflict or war, as has happened multiple times in the decades since both countries got independence. But if he doesn't do that, if he does sort of restrain his response to just the economy and sort of diplomacy, he risks facing a domestic backlash. Not just among the wider population, but particularly among his supporters. So I think that's why he's the loser of the week for me.
Interesting. Modi moving down there from lightly positive to just right in the boring middle. What other reaction have we seen from this? Have we seen the international reaction to the terror attack and the kind of widening tensions in the region? Yeah,
I mean, the basic thing has been widespread condemnation, as you might imagine. Pakistan as well, it should be pointed out, condemned it. So that was the immediate response. But as these tensions between Pakistan and India have been escalating, most countries, the UN as well, has been urging restraint, because nobody wants to see two nuclear-armed neighbours who have a history of really quite bad relations sort of firing missiles at each other, because the risk of escalation is obviously really quite significant. Yeah. I mean, I think Trump said he would, after the attack, he would back India's response. But the Trump administration, like lots of other governments, have also urged restraint. So there really isn't anyone sort of in the international community urging war between the two countries,
That
unsurprisingly.
makes sense. Yeah, I couldn't see that.
Both nuclear armed as well, worth saying. Yeah.
Yeah, that increases the scariness.
Scary.
Yeah. Interesting. We'll have to wait and see what happens next, how the international community continues to respond, hopefully without nuclear weapons. As is always the case. Doesn't need saying,
it's worth pointing out that since both countries got nuclear weapons, there's been one like major war in 1999, and then there have been exchanges of fire and even like aerial combat in 2019, I think. And that obviously didn't involve nuclear weapons, and they were quite short-lived and geographically constrained conflicts. But that's still not good.
No,
and that still creates a wider risk of escalation. So yeah.
Okay, Zach, you're up next. Who is your loser of the week?
My big loser of the week, and I've taken the audience's advice. I'm moving Keir Starmer down.
Okay.
2 reasons. I mean, the first is just the polling, right? And I think we all know this. I don't know if everyone does, but he is now reliably, in lots of polls, behind, or Labour rather, are behind Nigel Farage's Reform Party.
Yeah.
And the polling is all looking very precarious. I mean, they're basically 4 parties now, the Lib Dems and the Conservatives as well, all about 20%, which means that, Labour have really got their work cut out for them. They've got sort of threats on every side politically. But the other thing, and this is maybe a little bit less exciting, is about gilt yields, which is everyone's favorite topic.
Oh no!
It's another match opportunity.
Yeah,
I didn't think that was coming.
Yeah.
It's coming. But you might think that when there's some turmoil in America, that'd be good for the UK because investors would be pulling their cash out of America, putting it in sort of maybe UK bonds. But that just isn't really the way that bond markets work. In general, when the treasury market faces some sort of turmoil, that sort of roils every other sort of developed economy bond market as well. And that is what's happened in the UK, right? So treasury yields have gone up, borrowing costs have gone up for the US, and at the same time, UK borrowing costs have gone up. So UK bond yields have gone up. And that's just more bad news for Starmer and Reeves because, as anyone who lives in the UK probably already knows, they are so politically constrained by the public finances at the moment. And if borrowing costs go up any further, which does seem possible if Trump continues making some weird calls, they'll be in real trouble, especially because they'll be further squeezed by just the sort of global economic slowdown that's mainly Trump related, right? And that will just mean weaker growth, lower tax receipts.
Doesn't sound good. And it doesn't only not sound good because you're talking about gilt yields. But on the issue of the kind of political squeeze that Labour are experiencing, we obviously made a video about this last week too, actually, about the kind of the end of the 2-party system in the UK. The Lib Dem angle too, you brought up. That's one that's kind of less reflected on. The kind of Farage rise is kind of the obvious story because he is the kind of more inflammatory figure and also the kind of the one that's in first place. It naturally gets the most attention. Do you have any thoughts on the Lib Dems rise? Because as you say, that's also squeezing Labour. It's also putting pressure on. And it is kind of remarkable that kind of they've been able to hold this attention post-election. Kind of in 2024, it looked like the Lib Dem surge was being driven by Ed Davey on slides. And like, sure, he's still doing stunts, but like, it's no longer that anymore, right? Like the Lib Dems clearly have some momentum and they're kind of building as a party. So what do you make about that and also kind of what that means for Starmer going forward?
I mean, I think it's what's clearly sort of happening is that the Lib Dems are emerging as the sort of the more liberal alternative to Labour, for basically Labour voters who are disappointed with what I think you can describe as Starmer's tack to the right?
Yeah.
And I mean, with all of this, I don't know how seriously to take it. I just don't know how long that this sort of massive fracture in voting intention is going to last. Obviously, if this happened at general election, it would completely upend British politics, right?
Yeah.
If 4 parties got 20%, it would just give the weirdest result. We'd have no idea how to cope with it as a country. But I still think that the Lib Dems in lots of ways are behaving like a party in opposition. They're not behaving like a sort of, I don't mean this too rudely, but like as a serious party of government. Ed Davey's doing TikToks asking Starmer to 1v1 him at FIFA. And then the policy that grabbed the airwaves recently, they were talking about £1,000 bans for people who play music out without headphones, which
I support.
You support, but it's not really like it's not a policy platform. It's not sort
That's
of
all
like,
I need.
There you go, fair enough, exactly. But and all like rejoining the EU is another example.
Sure,
yeah.
We made a video about this too, right? Like the fact it's easy to be Lib Dems because well, there's at least an element of our video about the Lib Dems recently that you can promise things. You can promise a bank holiday whenever you want.
Exactly.
You're not
Something
gonna do
similar
it.
true of Reform, right? I
Yes.
think that you can, and I mean, obviously Reform are trying to now present themselves more as a party of government and moderating their policies in certain places. But like, it's easier to say, I'm going to bring down, you know, the small boat crossings or what, and deploy the army or something like that without actually having to be the party in government. But yeah, I mean, what I don't remember the question was. What was the point of this?
It was about what the Lib Dems' trajectory is and if they continue to be a threat to Starmer, basically.
I think a lot depends on the local elections, right?
Yeah.
In that, if Reform and the Lib Dems do well, that provides them with a sort of like local level base from which they can build. I still do have an intuition that by the end of the next 5 years, the two-party system will reassert itself. Although that being said, I think we should admit that the sort of Reform and Lib Dem poll surges have proved pretty persistent, and I think perhaps more persistent than some of the more narrow-minded commentators like myself assumed. So.
Wow, another hat for you, narrow-minded commentator. Got all kinds
That's
of
not like it's not a catchphrase. I've said it
no,
once.
but I want you wearing a
actually.
hat
Yeah, I
that
like that.
admits to being that.
And now, okay,
You got to
fair
own
enough,
it.
I'll take it.
Okay, let's move on. Georgina, who is your loser of the week?
My loser this week is Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban. This is because of his ongoing drive towards authoritarianism, basically. There's been a couple of things in the past month or so. So today, on Monday, two Hungarian media outlets are lodging a complaint with European Commission based on historical funding by the Fidesz government of pro-government media sources, amounting to over 1 billion euros between 2015 and 2023, which Orban has described as a system of national cooperation, but it's not. It's just government paying private media companies to, churn out pro-government propaganda. And also last month, so in March, Orban's government was trying to pass had drafted a constitutional amendment to basically encourage facilitate the expulsion of Hungarians with multiple passports who could feasibly be considered to be working in anti-government spaces like NGOs or civil society or media. And this is all basically because of the rise of an anti-Orban party, TISA, which is continuing to do very well in the polls while Orban continues to slump. There's now about an 8-point margin, up to an 8-point margin in some polls, and it's not looking good for Orban.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I do very much agree. The other thing I think is going to be a bit difficult for Orban is actually Trump. And you might think that Trump would be good news for Orban because obviously he's sort of one of Europe's nominal Trump whisperers. But Orban is also very sort of pro-China, I think is the best way to put it. I mean, he's made Hungary very open to Chinese investment. With some success, I think BYD is building a car factory in Hungary. But as recent comments by Trump and Trump administration officials suggest that one of the points of Trump's whole trade war strategy is to try and peel sort of countries away from China and to reduce their economic interdependence with China. And that will present a bit of a dilemma for Orban, right? Because obviously on the one hand, he wants to be close to Trump, but on the other, he already has quite a sort of deep economic relationship with Beijing. And if Trump forces his hand on that, that might put him in a bit of a spot.
Okay, well, let's find out whether Orban or one of our other people is the biggest loser of the week as we head into the final section of the show. Okay, so as always, we are now going to decide on the biggest winner and biggest loser of the week. We're going to go down the panel. If we have a consensus, then the person moves again on the board, either up or down. And if we don't have a consensus, then we just move on. Your options for the biggest winner of the week are Khamenei, Zelensky, and Bardella.
My what am I saying?
Ultimate winner, biggest winner. We change it each.
Biggest, ultimate, greatest winner for me is Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader. Mainly because I feel like from a sort of relative standpoint, I think that the potential for where things could go for him are pretty good. But yeah, that's why I've done it.
Unfortunately, it's already become redundant. I've gone for Jordan Bardella. I also think one of the things that we didn't really talk about then is that actually he's been unaffected by Trump's drag on the European right
Good point.
in a way that obviously other right wingers haven't. And I think that polling that Georgia mentioned is very, very positive for him.
Georgina?
For the same reason, Mr. Jordan Bardella.
Yeah, kind of similar, but
I'm the one who's ruined it.
Sorry, guys. It just felt so cheeky to have nicked it from Le Pen.
Yeah, she got
Her
purged
dad
from the
wanted it
board and
first, then
So
she,
true.
she wanted it.
So true.
The Le Pen
the whole Le
family.
Pen family is missing out.
They are.
Wow.
Don't feel too sorry for him. Your options for the ultimate loser of the week are Merz, Modi, Starmer, Orban. I fear we're not going to reach a consensus on any of these.
Oh, you know what? I'm quietly optimistic about this one. I think you might ruin this one, but
Often do. Rory, who is your ultimate loser of the week?
Friedrich Merz. I just think it's looking pretty dire for him, and he's not even in office yet. So
Oh, yeah.
same reason. I also, on that note, I've got to mention his personal approval ratings are in the dumps. I think he's about -40 already, which is crazy. Sort of 65-70% of Germans disapprove of him, and he's not even chancellor yet.
Georgina?
Unfortunately, I've already ruined it because I forgot Merz was an option. So
You
I've
can do
gone
a
for
last minute
Modi.
change.
Can I last minute?
Yeah, it's allowed. Would you have gone for Merz?
I would have gone for Merz,
Yeah,
but
okay,
I
we can-
actually forgot because he's in yellow. I wasn't.
I know.
I ignored him.
I did say Merz too. So
Go on, let's have it. Go on, let's take him down.
It's not on
I
the
can't
board,
believe this
unfortunately.
mechanism.
Sorry, guys.
No, I think the mechanism.
The mechanism failed.
The mechanism
Yeah.
has to stay strong. It's not about the people, it's about the mechanism.
That's a great hat phrase.
It's
about the
many
mechanism.
hats. It's such a long hat too. It's not about the
We're going to
people.
lose
It's about
so much money on these hats.
okay. So the ultimate winner of the week there is Bardella, but doesn't move again because we didn't reach consensus. And the ultimate loser is Merz, but again doesn't move again because we didn't reach consensus. But never mind, there's always chance for them to win and lose next week. So join us then when we'll move yet more people. And of course, we will move or add your suggestion in the comments. So make sure you add your own comments and also vote up ones that you like. And then we'll join you next Wednesday.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.